Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're from the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. I'm Lisa Thompson, and Liz Mizell could not be here today, but I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Claire Richards is a nurse scientist at the Washington State University College of Nursing. She earned her PhD in nursing science from the University of Washington and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Department of Veteran Affairs in the University of Washington in 2020. Her research focuses on climate adaptation and decision-making for protecting the health of vulnerable individuals during power outages. She received a new faculty seed grant in 2021 to study the concurrent exposure of populations in Washington state to power outages, extreme heat, and wildfire smoke. And she also received a National Science Foundation Navigating the New Arctic Award in 2022 for a multi-institutional study in Alaska to investigate electrical grid and community resilience to wildfires. So thank you very much, Claire, for coming to speak with us. And if you wanted to share your slides.
I just need to...
I have to give you permission?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. How do I do that now? That's the next thing. Share screen.
Just usually it's just click on participants and then change to co-host.
Try it now to see if it...
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay. There we go. And I will turn this into... All right, so
We're seeing the presenter mode.
Okay, so it's on the wrong. Usually I'm able to do this more quickly. I'm just going to do screen 1. Nope, screen 2. But for some reason, hold on. Got it. That working?
You got it. Yep.
All right. So my apologies for the text at the bottom. So there we go. All right. So I'm going to be talking with you a bit about energy insecurity. So as it relates to my work, but I'd also like it to be a discussion among us to learn from each other. So my work is mostly focused on the US context. And we typically think of energy insecurity as something that occurs in other countries. So I know, Lisa, you are focused on work in other countries. And so I invite your comments. So I'll be talking a bit about what is energy insecurity, and then I'll share some of our work on the power outages in Washington State. Very briefly talk about the firewall project that was funded by the NSF, and then we can play with some data. I brought some links and some different sources. So if you're interested in learning more about what kind of data you can use to look at power outages, play with that. So energy insecurity and security was first described in the literature in 2008 on PubMed. And this actually happened, it was published in 2008, and the authors described an increase in energy costs that had occurred around the time of the study between 2003 and 2006. And so you can kind of see that on the map, like on this, sorry, not on the map, on the figure here, where there's like a little bit of a dip before there was an increase in fracking of shale gas. So I thought that was important to point out And I'll talk a bit more about why I think that's important. But they didn't actually define what energy insecurity was, but they implied that it was about making difficult choices about energy use as compared to other ways of using their money to pay for food or medical care. And then also unsafe energy use, which has been described as like, people using stoves to heat their home or other like, burning things in their home to increase their comfort in the house. And in 2016, there was the first time I've seen where it was described as like chronic and acute definitions of energy insecurity. And so specifically thinking about chronic as being more about energy burden and the response or behaviors to difficulty paying, while acute definitions included actual shutoffs from not paying and power outages or power shutoffs from like wildfires. And then in 2020, the term energy sovereignty was the first time that appeared in the PubMed literature. And that describes, energy, both energy sovereignty and energy equity as a human right, and also that its scarcity is a result of an energy system and power differentials, and make basically this like the energy industry is making profit off of what would be considered an essential service or human need. It also highlights the effect of colonization, in that the same communities experiencing energy burden are also places where resources and energy has been extracted. And so I think this is important because these different terms of energy sovereignty and energy equity really focus on addressing sustainability, and that, continuing to expand fossil fuels rather than like developing renewable energies, especially that are in control of communities, that can foster this expansion of fossil fuels. Basically fosters dependence on private fossil fuel companies. So I think language is really important. And as we move forward thinking about this, I think it's important to remember that. I don't know what the implications are, but when we think of energy security, it kind of suggests a little bit of dependence on someone else to provide for us rather than our communities providing for themselves. So I wanted to share just a little tidbit about chronic energy insecurity in Washington State. I'm going to be focusing on more acute energy insecurity related to power outages. But, well, this is about accumulation of debt. They also call it areages, which is like a super weird word. I can't believe it, even when I say it out loud. They also call it arrears. So anyway, it's basically looking at, this is from a report prepared in Washington State for the Energy Project, looking at the accumulation of debt across different zip codes in Washington State. And what they found was that nearly all the top 5 zip codes with high residential areages include highly impacted communities, which is highly impacted communities is like a measure of cumulative impacts of environmental, health, and socioeconomic disparities that we have through our Department of Health, available for different levels like zip codes and counties in Washington State. So they looked at the zip code level, and they found that there's this consistent disparity of higher levels of debt for zip codes that are experience the highest amount of disparity. So they used data that comes from the Washington Utility Transportation Commission, which required this reporting. And there's also about, information about the number of disconnections. And remember, that's like more about acute energy insecurity, but there's obviously a relationship between the two. So moving on to power outages, this is a figure from the Climate Central, and they are comparing the number of outages in the US that are weather related with non-weather related power outages over time. And research has shown using largely, this is data that comes from the Department of Energy. These are data sets of outages that affected more than 50,000 customers in an area. So it tends to focus mostly on urban areas or areas where utilities are larger. And so not your states that have a lot of smaller utilities. But what they have found is that it has risen nationally, and that there are, the causes of these power outages include this aging infrastructure and also increased hazards like storms, and also activities around preventing wildfire. And so about half of all major outages are due to weather. I would also just say that because a lot of this data is limited to large utilities, we know less about areas that are more rural. So I actually read an article that concluded that based on this data set, that there's like less outages in Alaska. It's just that none of the utilities in Alaska are large enough to show up in these like data sets. So the health impacts of major outages are carbon monoxide poisoning, temperature-related illness like too hot or too cold, gastrointestinal illness from eating food that has like spoiled, and then all-cause mortality and cardiovascular, respiratory, and renal disease hospitalizations, especially for people who are dependent on electricity through their medical equipment. And so here on the right, you can see this figure that this figure in the middle shows basically kind of what you can think about as like the disruption to an infrastructure service. And you might think of that as like the restoration time of an outage. And it describes basically this social dimension here that gets at the crux of this issue, that there's an accumulation of research that shows the impact of disasters on our energy infrastructure isn't equally distributed. And so that's where we get into some of this like social vulnerability metrics about socioeconomic status and disability and age and ethnicity and different factors like housing quality and education that can increase a person's susceptibility to an outage, and also decrease their ability to respond or prepare for that, but also that the literature is showing that there's actually more exposure for some of these groups of people. And I'd say it's still pretty nascent literature, but there is an accumulation of that. And just for those who are not as familiar with the electric utility grid, I thought this was interesting. I was looking for figures and I just threw on the one on both of these figures because the one from the EIA only shows like a fossil fuel plant producing the energy. The one from the EPA also has like hydropower and wind. They could improve this with like some solar panels. But anyway, basically the transmission lines are what take that energy from the source of the power to the substations, and then those are distributed to communities. So most of the outages actually occur along these distribution lines rather than through transmission, or even from supply and demand problems, although that is expected to increase over time due to climate change. So definitions of outages are there's not a consensus on what is an outage or what's a major event. So these are a list of them. We have like at the top, the US Department of Energy, and you can see that there's statewide, it's statewide level, but actually the data is collected from utilities that are serving any customers in the state. So you might have like a large utility that serves like 8 or 10 counties in the state, and it's all accumulated into one metric for the whole state. And it's only reported, they have a lot of different like requirements for reporting, but the major event outage is like 50,000 customers for at least an hour. And then there's some other data that use different percentiles or numbers, absolute numbers of customers who are affected. And the absolute and relative scales are important because the absolute scale has a preference towards identifying outages that affect urban areas, whereas the relative metric can identify outages that are occurring in more rural areas. And then there was a recent study from Flores, which was in Texas, and they use a metric of 10,000 customers for counties that have at least 10,000 customers, and then also a relative scale of 20%. Now, I think it's important, I'll be talking a little bit about more of these metrics, but the 20% can also be thought of as a different metric that's more used in the utilities, which is the SAFE. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that metric, but that's important because typically in research, we haven't used SAFE as like an outcome in research for, describing disproportionate or exposure to outages. And so it might be thought of as different than what the research is actually doing, but 20% of customers is basically SAFE because you would expect every person would be exposed one time in a day, not multiple times. So anyway, that's getting a little bit too in the weeds. So you have social vulnerability and exposure to power outages. This is not complete, but this is just the accumulation, some accumulation of literature describing, increased exposure to outages, depending, with different definitions of what those outages are. They might be looking at, absolute or relative metrics of outages, or just like restoration times. Like how long does it take to get power back for different counties, and looking at what are the percentages of people in that county who have what are described as like characteristics of social vulnerability. And I'm not going to get into social vulnerability very much here because it's a whole thing in itself, but it's a bit of a controversial topic, I would say, and with different measures of social vulnerability. So what originally motivated this study, I'm about to share some details with you about, is this relationship that affects the West and the Pacific Northwest as well, which is that power outages can be caused by like wildfire, and also efforts to reduce wildfire. So we don't have that much power shutoffs in Washington state yet, or actually even plans. We have like what you call dry code outages, where they just don't automatically turn the power on. So those outages might be longer. So if there are conditions that could lead to wildfire, like high temperatures, drought, and strong winds, then they would do what they call like a public safety power shutoff, although that terminology is controversial, and some would say power shutoff is more appropriate because we don't necessarily know that it, it increases safety for everyone or even anyone really, because we don't have any data on that. And it can cause its own risks as well. So anyway, that basically when there are these conditions that can lead to wildfire, it can also lead to other conditions that can make those power outages more risky, such as like high temperatures. So, so that's what motivated this study. And then also the issue of air pollution, like wildfire smoke, which our primary prevention strategy for dealing with, other than leaving the area or staying inside, is to use air purifiers, which also depend on electricity. So the objective of this study was to use data from poweroutage.us to characterize population level exposure to power outages in Washington and develop metrics of power outage burden. I started out looking at heat, but then it's very difficult because of the lack of real great metrics of what outage burden is, that I took a step back to just describe outage burden first, and then we'll layer in the heat and the air quality after. And so then to also characterize what are the demographic and clinical characteristics of populations exposed to extreme heat and power outages. But for this one, I'll be sharing with you, we're just looking at just the power outages. So the data that we're using is this poweroutage.us data that I mentioned, and also data from the EIA on the customer counts and reliability metrics for utilities as well as the state. And then also data from the Department of Energy on major events to compare whether we're able to identify all of the major events and verify our methods. And then also data from the American Community Survey, demographic information, Empower data set, which I'll be sharing a little bit about for electricity dependent medical equipment use, and then the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And so this is like the, whenever there's like large power outages, there are, the media will describe like the number of people who are affected by an outage, typically by looking at the poweroutage.us website, which doesn't include all of the utilities in an area, but you can purchase the data from them. And this is kind of what the data looks like. You get the utility, the state, the county, the city, the customers tracked, and the customers out, and the date time stamp. The customers tracked is not a very good metric for most utilities. Every now and then you'll find a utility that has like a pretty reliable metric, but generally it's not. So that meant that I had to actually do a very convoluted way to figure out what are the number of customers in Washington state, because across the different counties, because we don't have great 100% coverage of the utilities, and I can't just assume that I can't use some of the methods that other studies have done to figure out the county level customers. So the power outage outcomes that I used the SAIDI, which I realize is like super wonky term. It's like something that utilities use to report their reliability, and it's an average duration of power outage for, sorry, it says for customers affected, but it's for customers, for all the customers. So it's typically going to be a smaller number than like some of the other metrics like CAIDI, which is like the actual outage for the customers who experience the outage. So you have the sum of the customers affected times time over the total customers. And then I also figured out the SAFE, which you basically divide the number, you have to figure out the number of customers who are affected by the number of total customers, and it's actually not a very straightforward process. but it is basically equivalent to what you would be calculating for a fraction of customers who are affected at any time. It's just that when you have like a shorter time frame, like a day or an hour or whatever, the typical studies would just look at the number of customers who are affected over a total number of customers and assume that's the fraction rather than I have the wrong definition of safety. I'm sorry. It says average duration of power outage. It's the average number of interruptions for customers. So, for the analysis, we explored the validity of the power outage data and compared it to the annual reliability and major event data. And then we're really close to finishing a two-part generalized linear mixed effects models with negative binomial family and log link function with offsetting the population. And so in the what I'm modeling instead of like the SAFE and the SADI is actually the numerators of those, the numerators here, and then offsetting the total number of populations, because this is basically a rate. So that's why. So this is a little bit of information about the data quality, and you can see like a Vista, Column County, Inland Power, Mason County, Pacific Power, like the ones that are all kind of orange. Those ones are reporting like, instead of having a subdivision of like a city name, they just have unknown. And they don't actually break it down by city. So it's just county level. And then you can see like for some utilities, like what kind of city breakdown they had changed over time, like Seattle City Light towards the bottom here, they had only one subdivision, and then like sort of midstream during the study period started to report it on a subdivision level. So this meant that when I first started, I was hoping to get more granular than that, but I decided to just focus on the county level data. There's a lot of problems with the subdivision names, like including the fact that they might have a zip code, but it's actually not a zip code served by the utility. So that presents a real challenge for anyone trying to do a study on a smaller level, unless you are working with an area that has better data, because each utility reports the data differently. So if you happen to live in an area where that utility is more consistent and has higher quality data, then you might be able to get away with doing something like that. Or especially if it's a shorter amount of time, right? If it's a shorter amount of time, like a couple of days, 3 days, then they're not going to be changing the amount of how they're aggregating the data within that time frame that you're studying. So I think it's more of a challenge when you're looking at a longer time frame. So this is so basically then I was trying to understand, when I looked at the major events, I found that some major events were missing from my data set, and I found that happened in December of 2018. And that caused me to like stop and look at the utility data, and I found that there was a big gap where Puget Sound Energy stopped reporting their outages to the I don't know if they stopped reporting them, but they stopped being recorded by poweroutage.us. So I don't know if the API was broken in the background, like the handshake in the back was just like broken, and poweroutage.us didn't know, but it created this problem because it actually happened during a major event where there is this missing data here. And then you can see, especially for those utilities that serve multiple counties, it's easier to tell when they go kind of offline, because you see like a line like that, like in August of 2020, where they just like disappear. And then the smaller utilities, they're not going to have outages all of the time. And so like gaps for them may or may not really be an issue. So this is presented a bit of a methodological challenge, to say the least. So I first started by excluding, after kind of processing the data, and this isn't everything that I've excluded, but the major thing is that there was like some utilities here where they didn't come online until like the fall, or they seemed to only appear, like Pend Oreille and Northern Lights. They only came on for a short amount of time. as far as I can tell, like that's a really long time not to report any outages. So I dropped those utilities from the analysis. And then also some of them that just had really long gaps in their observations that were like most of the time period. And then, so the final analysis included 15 utilities serving 27 counties. And so I started out looking at like, what is the pattern of outage data availability? And what you can see is like the ones here, this map, like they're like a light blue, you can see that they're basically not in the data set at all. But then you also have some utilities, some counties where like, say there's one utility that's in the data set and one that's not. Those are the lighter colors. And there's like, when you look at the comparison between the proportion of data coverage in the set by social vulnerability metrics, what you see is there's a trend, statistical significance for rural counties and less densely populated counties to appear in the data set. They're like less likely to have data. And also those counties that have a higher energy burden, higher rates of disability, use of durable medical equipment, or living in a mobile home, or less have lower representation in the data set. And then also there's differences for older age, and the social vulnerability index is not statistically significant. It's pretty wide. They're pretty skewed data. So it's either 0 or 45 or 100%, that kind of weird data. So, and then, so this is our ultimate estimates for, and I included Katie here, even though I didn't describe it, but basically these are reliability metrics that we estimated compared to the EIA. And I excluded 2018 because it was a partial year and it had that huge gap. But you can see that our metrics are pretty good compared to the EIA. Except, you know, the EIA data doesn't allow you to look at time. So by really doing this analysis, this is a cumulative graph of person time by year. So you can see over time when those like large outages occur, when there are smaller outages for each year. And, you know, 2021 had the most outages for the time period. But like this little tiny hump right here in June of 2021 was when there was a heat dome. So, so even if it's a small like hump, it doesn't mean that it's not important. So that's some of the challenge. And then also you can look at the change over time by, you know, location as well. And this is a map of the average SAIDI experience by day over time as well. So people who are not as familiar with Washington State, like it won't stand out for you, but like King County is like the really dark blue one in 2021. So it's like, you know, a very big urban area. So, and then Ferry County is this little tiny county that's like the second dark one on the far right side, close second over. That one is, and also Stevens County is an area where we have the Colville tribe. And they have experienced a lot of wildfire. And I don't understand exactly why it's much significantly, the outages are a lot higher in Stevens County than Ferry County. But there may be less data. Anyway. So basically there's this lack of geographic granularity, and there's other data limitations that make it hard to understand the power outage data. Misclassification bias is a potential problem, especially when you're thinking about, you know, not knowing who's actually affected. So if you want to look at the health impacts of outages, that is a very big difficulty, I think. But still, like if we clean the data really well, you can get pretty good reliability metrics for the utilities and then have them on a county level and over time, whereas they're typically reported just for the year. And I think that this is really helpful to use these kinds of more continuous measures rather than the thresholds where it's just over a certain number, because we don't actually know what matters when it comes to these metrics. Like a fraction of 20% may be a very high metric. You might not need to hit 20% for an area that is experiencing a heat dome for that to be a significant event. So specific interventions that we could consider to reduce the health impacts of power outages that have been described in the literature. There's like battery backup and solar. There's disaster planning and coordination between utilities. So a key way to reduce those impacts of power outages on vulnerable populations is for utilities to work with emergency managers to address social vulnerability. And that's one of the things that we're working on with the firewall project in Alaska. Also, a key thing is developing of the data sharing agreements in advance of an emergency. So the Empower data that I shared earlier, like that data is available aggregated on a county level, but it also can be available you can get the health department can get granular information about like the location of individuals during a disaster, but the public health department needs to sign a specific agreement to receive that information. And then they need to be able to share that information with authorities that can take action on that information. And so that's been an issue in certain places like Puerto Rico, where over time and time again, like there's a lack of ability to access that information in a way that's timely. And we've seen the same thing in California as well. So those types of actions could potentially save lives if we do them in advance of an event. And then also like another thing that we can do is determine where places distributed energy can be placed in a way that's equitable. And I also think considering sustainability and thinking about air pollution when you start putting out generators and how that affects others in the area is also really important. And then increasing emergency preparedness of communities and also other strategies to reduce co-occurring impacts of power outages, like when there's heat, thinking about landscaping to reduce heat in homes and other ways of building codes. Think about that as an impact, reducing those impacts that go beyond having to do things like backup power, which can be very costly. And then also addressing social determinants of health, which contribute to inequitable outcomes of outages. So very briefly, I'll talk about the firewall project we're doing in Alaska, and Dr. Hadari is here as well, who invited me onto that project. And that is the firewall project, Foundations for Improving Resilience in the Energy Sector Against Wildfires on Alaskan Lands. And we are working to see whether we can develop a collaborative decision support platform for utilities to make decisions in advance of wildfire, for say like where they might address vegetation around their grids, but also to develop collaborative frameworks potentially between those utilities and emergency managers and other community stakeholders to reduce those impacts of outages during a wildfire. And so this is the social pillar. So we're going to be asking stakeholders about what kind of information they need, looking at what kind of vulnerability metrics would be helpful, and how we can develop this collaborative framework. So this is where I wanted to shift to like looking at some of the tools. If you all are interested in looking at some of the data that's available, there's actually have sent.
Yeah, we do have those. You sent the email to me.
Okay, great.
Maybe we could share them on our website under your talk so that people, when they're looking at our website, could hit those links as well.
Yeah, that would be
I can also send them out to the research working group.
Awesome. So this is the low income energy affordability data tool. it basically, you can identify different levels of geographic, different geographic levels, so counties or census tracts, cities, states, and look at energy burden. And so you can see this, I actually pulled up West Virginia because I thought it would be interesting because there was a study on power outages nationwide that showed higher levels of power outages for areas in Western Virginia. So I just pulled this up and I'm very curious, like, does that overlap with the energy burden? Let's see. Then we have this is the Utility Transportation Commission data. So this is Washington State. So it might be different for you in your own state, where you would find data and how it is super like not accessible. Like it's really hard. You have to contact people there and find out where the data is. And this is specifically for investor-owned utilities. This is the Empower program. So they have data different. Basically, you can get like the number of people who rely on electricity dependent medical equipment and the number of Medicare beneficiaries, and you can create a rate. What's the rate in that area? And this is energy.gov. So here you have your electric disturbance events over time. And again, this is limited because it's just 50,000 customers for an hour. And then we have the EIA data. This is, you can click on this. It has a lot of different information, including reliability metrics for different utilities. And that's it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richards. That was really super interesting. I've never thought about this in this way in the context of the United States. Like you said, a lot of my work is in places where people are still using kerosene for lighting, and they have a different set of factors for energy insecurity. And, you know, in the context of cook stoves, which is the specific thing I work on, you know, we're trying to provide people with gas stoves because they're the only thing that's like easily available, you know, to transport those little propane tanks, because there's no reliable electricity in areas that have like rolling, you know, brownouts 4 hours a day, every day, you know, so I think, but it's still the same. I mean, the people that are super low income are the ones that are most affected by these, and they can't pay their bills, and then they get into debt. And then, you know, I really appreciate you're giving us the definitions for some of this. So I want to just allow others to ask questions. We have about 10 minutes. So anybody want to ask a question? I have a question, maybe while everyone else is thinking. You know, I was thinking back to when I was in California, and I had my house out there, and they had great solar panel programs that you could somewhat subsidize. You could put them on your roof, but then you end up selling your solar back to the grid, and maybe you'll get a discount on the PG&E bill, but you're never entirely off the grid or reliant, you know. So when you're talking about energy sovereignty, I kept thinking about what have you thought about? What do you know about plans for people to actually kind of live off their own solar panel? And I also heard there was this thing about cars, batteries actually being used to feed back into houses when there's brownouts that people could use, or power outages, that they could use their car batteries for days to feed into the house. And I don't know, just kind of how do we stop relying on the corporations that own the power that we have to pay?
I don't know if anyone else wants to take a stab at that, because I don't have, I mean, I think that I always think about equity first. And so probably most people who really are off the grid in the US context, well, there's a lot, it's really different in Alaska. where there's a lot more microgrids there than there are here. But I think for like one's own home being sort of off any grid, I don't know. I think that would be mostly accessible to people who have a lot of money, and not like everyone. And so I think when I think of energy sovereignty, I think of, shifting from a framework of energy for profit to energy as like a human need. But then I also was reading this article that was in Florida where they talked about higher levels of outages for counties that were served by city-owned municipal utility districts. So that was because of a lack of funding for dealing with the response. So that's just like something that I think we have to consider, is like how do we have a transition to clean energy with if we have energy sovereignty, really thinking about how do we still have make profitable, I guess, like a response to an outage. I don't know, how do you improve? I don't, but that's just one state, so I wouldn't necessarily make generalization from that and say that's everywhere.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, especially in the US, where each state kind of has its own, we're encouraged to be individual states in a united country, but everybody kind of sets their own rules. We don't seem to have like that overview, but I don't know. I see Nelson Toisson, do you want to ask a question?
No, I just want to say thank you. Very, very interesting. I work in a hospital, and I was interested to hear about the impact of shortages or outages, because we feel it when there is I live in Texas, by the way. So personally, we're affected. Thank God we have generators. But in the summertime, if there's outages and we have patients that suffer from respiratory illnesses because they have no conditioning.
Right.
So that's the main issue that they have. And it's predicted that I think there's an additional 10 days in the next coming years that we will be over 100 degrees in Texas.
Right. Yeah, I think that is a very big concern. And I think that's where, thinking about, I think it's really important that our strategies for dealing with heat are not like primarily focused on air conditioning. Like, it's just, first of all, everyone is not going to access air conditioning until we can figure out how to decrease the greenhouse warming potential of the refrigerants. Like, it's just not
right.
Like the adaptation becomes really maladaptive. And so I think, but then also you have power outages that can happen even without it being related to the heat. You can just have like in the Pacific Northwest, you can have a big earthquake during summer, and what are you going to do? I asked our emergency preparedness folks for Washington State about that. If they think about earthquakes and the heat dome, and they just like laughed at me and said that's just worse to worser. And I'm like, that's like what I'm afraid of.
Yeah. But do you have any opinion or idea why California has more fires than Texas when we're supposed to be hotter than California? Because you see all these wildfires because I saw your firewall project about wildfires in Alaska. Thank God I've been in Texas now for 13 years, and we don't see those kind of disasters that California suffers from.
I don't know, but I would assume it has something to do with the vegetation in Texas.
I think that the Pacific Northwest has so many trees, and then there also lots of underbrush. I think that talking about the way that traditionally areas were cleared of underbrush or periodically set on fire to reduce the burns. So I think, forest management has been
Yeah,
struggling with catching up to understand how to control fires with controlled burns, because that's not good for air pollution for sure. But
right.
it is a 3-week long fire that devastates acres and acres, of land. So maybe Texas doesn't have as many trees.
Or it might be the kind of trees we have.
Mhm.
Because I don't see, I used to live in New Jersey too. So in the fall, that's all you do. You rake the leaves. And here I noticed that I don't see that as much. So who knows? If there's one comment or suggestion I'll make is, you mentioned about the social vulnerability index. And I know you also are studying resilience. I wonder if there's a relationship between those who are vulnerable, but also have high resilience. You mentioned something about in some areas, they don't rely on electricity, but they have firewood and so on and so forth. So they're not affected by outages as much as those who rely on power.
Right.
I come from the Philippines, so I can live with no electricity for months because that's just the way we live. So I guess our resilience in terms of not having electricity is higher than those who lived in the city, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I
So
mean-
I think it's really important to like, I didn't get into this in the presentation and I thought about it, but there's like frameworks for vulnerability.
Mhm.
And so you think about vulnerability as a relationship between susceptibility,
Mhm.
adaptive capacity.
Yeah.
And so like people who are dependent on electricity, like say they have an oxygen concentrator or a nebulizer, and they get the power goes out,
Then
they are going to be more vulnerable than someone who doesn't have that. But then I think it also, there's this other layer here, which is like, what are the coexisting stuff that's happening at the same time?
Yeah.
Like, is it really hot? Is it really cold?
Mhm.
But then like, I think that the cultural factors are also really important too. And I haven't even begun to like wrap my
Yeah.
head around them, but like communities working together, to support each other, like that's one of the biggest like factors for emergency preparedness is knowing who your neighbors
Mhm.
are, right?
Mhm.
And the US is so individualistic.
Yeah.
So
Well,
then
but thankful,
everybody has to have a solar panel, right? Like everybody's got to have their own backup.
Right.
We can have 1 more hour of this. One last comment. Last week we had a power outage here for maybe less than 12 hours in my own home. It was a weekend, and the effects that you mentioned does not include social isolation. We didn't have internet for 12 hours. I thought my son and I gonna go crazy.
Well, in California, when they had the power shutoffs, like I had family out there and they were saying, and there were news reports after one of the, I think it was like when I first started, they were so happy to all be outside together. Like they were like, we're all having a picnic out here with our barbecues. Like,
Yes, that's a great way to end it, I think, too. It's like, how dependent do we really need to be on some of this electrical stuff versus, can we find a different way to do it? But I thank you so much for, we're now at 4:00, and I want to thank you for coming and speaking to us about this interesting topic that I hadn't really thought about. So I learned a lot, and we'll be posting this on YouTube for other viewers. And I look forward to learning about your work in Alaska too, which sounds really great. So thank you very much.
thank you.
Nice to meet you, Mohammed and Virginia as well. Okay.
Nice to see you all. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Lisa.